The heavy soundproof glass door of the private server room slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Julian Kwon, a man who built his empire on predicting the unpredictable, froze in the doorway. It was exactly 2 a.m. His penthouse, a sprawling fortress of glass and steel hovering 70 floors above the sleeping city, was supposed to be completely dead silent. Instead, the cool clinical blue glow of his central mainframe illuminated a figure standing over the master console. It was Clara, his quiet, unassuming evening maid. But she wasn't holding a microfiber cloth, and she certainly wasn't shrinking away in fear at the sight of her billionaire boss. Her fingers were flying across his holographic keyboard with terrifying practice speed, bypassing his military-grade firewalls like they were made of cheap paper. Julian's dark, intensely sharp eyes narrowed. The bespoke silk robe he wore felt suddenly suffocating against his chest. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room. His voice was a low, dangerous command, the exact tone that usually made seasoned board members tremble in their bespoke suits. He asked her exactly what she thought she was doing in his secure terminal. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply hit the enter key with a soft tap. The massive curved screen flashed a brilliant green, signaling a successful breach, right before she turned around to face him. The dim blue light caught the rich, deep melanin of her skin, highlighting the flawless, unapologetic curves of her silhouette. Even beneath the drab, oversized maid's uniform she wore, her striking, hyper-feminine figure was impossible to hide. She leaned back against the multi-million-dollar server rack, casually crossing her arms beneath her chest. A slow, deeply mocking smile curved her full, lush lips. She looked him dead in his dark, piercing eyes and told him she was just doing a little deep cleaning, casually mentioning that his supposedly flawless security protocols were gathering dust. The sheer audacity of her response sent a jolt of pure, electric adrenaline straight through Julian's chest. For 6 months, she had been a quiet, respectful presence in his life. A breathtakingly beautiful African woman who kept her eyes cast downward, who poured his black coffee with quiet grace, and who never spoke unless spoken to. He had found himself inexplicably distracted by her warmth, by the mesmerizing sway of her hips as she moved through his cold, sterile, monochromatic world. But he had dismissed it. He had severely underestimated her. And Julian Kwon, the ruthless tech mogul, never underestimated anyone. Before he could demand a real answer, before he could even reach for the emergency security panic button mounted on the wall, the massive screen surrounding them violently flashed from green to a blaring blood red. A mechanical, automated voice echoed through the expansive penthouse. It announced a critical external breach. It announced the immediate initiation of Protocol Absolute Zero. Clara's mocking smile instantly vanished. She whipped around, her hands slamming back onto the glowing console, typing frantically as lines of red code cascaded down the monitors. Julian watched her, his sharp, aristocratic jaw clenching so tight it ached. He demanded to know what she just did. Clara shot back over her shoulder, her voice losing its cool edge for the very first time. She swore she didn't do it. She told him she was perfectly and completely undetected, but someone on the outside just triggered a massive brute force cyber attack on the secondary grid. She told him her employers were burning her cover. A deafening, terrifying grinding noise echoed from the perimeter of the penthouse. Julian rushed out of the server room and into the hallway, looking out into the expansive, minimalist living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows that usually overlooked the glittering, sprawling city skyline were being rapidly swallowed in total darkness. Massive, solid steel blast shields were slamming down over the reinforced glass, locking into place with heavy, earth-shaking metallic thuds. The sleek, modern overhead lighting completely died, instantly replaced by the pulsing, heavy red glow of the emergency floor tracks. The magnetic locks on the heavy front doors sealed shut with a sound like a bank vault closing forever. The steady hum of the central air conditioning sputtered, choked, and completely died. Absolute Zero wasn't just a simple security lockdown. It was a brutal quarantine protocol Julian had designed himself to trap corporate spies inside until an armed extraction team arrived. They were completely, inescapably sealed in. If you are hooked on this intense, high-stakes lockdown, Take 1 second to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. You could also support this channel by buying the super thanks. And a huge shout out to everyone that has used the super thanks button below. Your support directly funds the AI generation tools and premium voiceover software that bring these breathtaking characters to life. Now, let's get right back into the vault. Julian turned slowly back toward the server room. Clara was calmly packing a sleek, silver decryption drive into a small tactical pouch. The submissive maid's facade was completely, utterly gone. She moved with the predatory, fluid grace of someone highly trained, someone who knew exactly how dangerous the situation had just become. Julian stepped squarely into her path, his broad shoulders blocking the only exit. He was tall, his presence suffocatingly dominant, but Clara didn't back down a single inch. She stepped right up to him, forcing him to look down into her deep, striking brown eyes. Julian's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. He told her she had exactly 5 seconds to tell him who she worked for before he tied her to a chair and let the federal authorities handle her. Clara let out a short, breathy laugh. It was a sound of pure disbelief that sent an unexpected, fiery shiver down Julian's spine. She told him the federal authorities couldn't get through those solid steel doors if they brought a tank. She reminded him of his own brilliant engineering. By the time his private security team bypassed the blast shields from the outside, they would both be completely dead from oxygen depletion, unless they figured out a way to manually vent the internal system. Then, she did something that completely short-circuited his brilliant mind. She reached up, her elegant hands going to the high collar of her frumpy, oversized maid's dress. Julian watched, momentarily paralyzed, as she gripped the cheap fabric and pulled hard. The hidden breakaway seams tore open instantly. She shrugged off the bulky uniform, letting it pool around her boots on the cold floor. Underneath, she wasn't wearing standard clothes. She wore a sleek, midnight black tactical suit that clung to every single dip, curve, and flare of her incredibly lush figure. The suit was designed for stealth and function, but on her, against the deep, radiant perfection of her dark skin, it was devastatingly distracting. She casually unzipped the front just enough to let her collarbones breathe, revealing the smooth skin underneath. Julian's breath physically hitched. The icy, perfectly controlled billionaire persona he wore like a suit of armor violently cracked. He dragged his eyes away from the curve of her waist, forcing himself to meet her challenging gaze. He swallowed hard. He told her she was a corporate extractor. Clara stepped around him, the tight space forcing her hip to lightly, deliberately brush against his thigh. She corrected him. She told him she was the best corporate extractor in the Western Hemisphere, and right now, her brain was the only thing standing between him and total financial ruin. She walked past him into the red-lit living room, her boots clicking softly against the expensive hardwood. The temperature inside the sealed penthouse was already beginning to noticeably rise. With the blast shields down and the ventilation completely dead, the massive space was turning into an insulated, airtight oven. Julian followed her, his analytical mind racing to catch up. The betrayal stung, yes, but beneath the immediate anger, a dark, consuming fascination was rapidly taking root in his chest. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who nodded at his every word, people who feared his sharp intellect and his endless wealth. But Clara? Clara had infiltrated his private sanctuary, served him his dinner, smiled softly at his passing comments, all while flawlessly plotting to dismantle his empire from the inside out. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a pawn. She was an apex predator, matching him step for step. He found her standing by the dead, modern fireplace, tapping the side of a decrypted burner phone against her palm. No signal. She cursed softly under her breath, a melodic sound even in her frustration. Julian leaned against the edge of his expensive leather sofa, folding his arms. The pulsing red emergency lights cast deep, dramatic shadows across the room, highlighting the fierce, determined set of her jaw and the proud lift of her chin. He asked her, his voice deceptively calm, exactly who hired her. He wanted to know whose name he was going to systematically destroy when he finally got out of this cage. Clara looked at him over her shoulder, her dark eyes flashing with a potent mix of amusement and genuine frustration. She told him that if he knew anything at all about her underground world, he would know she never, ever burned a client. Julian pushed off the sofa, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. The air was getting thick, the heat beginning to press in on them like a physical weight. He stopped just inches from her, deliberately using his towering height to try and intimidate her. He leaned down, his face dangerously close to hers. He told her that her loyal clients just burned her. He explained that they triggered the perimeter alarm to trap her inside, leaving her to take the ultimate fall while they remotely stole the data she had so graciously unlocked for them on the compromised secondary grid. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine vulnerability crossed Clara's beautiful face. Julian saw it. He saw the harsh realization hit her that she had been completely betrayed by her own people. But she recovered instantly. Her spine stiffened. Instead of shrinking away, she pushed her chest closer to his, refusing to retreat. The heat radiating between their bodies was suddenly palpable, overwhelming. She looked up at him, entirely unbothered by his glare. She told him he talked entirely too much for a man who had just lost complete control of his own house. The physical proximity was maddening. Julian could smell the faint, intoxicating scent of vanilla and something distinctly metallic, like ozone, lingering on her warm skin. A single bead of sweat rolled down the side of his sharp, aristocratic jawline. He was practically vibrating with pent-up tension. Half of him wanted to throttle her for the betrayal. He wanted to pin her against the heavy steel of the blast shield and interrogate her until she gave up every single secret she had. But the other half of him, the half he kept buried deep down, wanted to know exactly what it felt like to strip away that dark tactical suit entirely. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He wasn't just furious. He was fiercely, undeniably turned on by her brilliance, by her curves, by her absolute defiance. Drop a comment down below and tell me, what would you do if you were trapped in a sweltering room with your gorgeous, brilliant enemy? Who do you think is going to break first? Let me know and keep listening. Clara saw the immediate shift in his dark eyes. The cold, calculating stare of the untouchable CEO had completely vanished, replaced by something much darker, much more primal and hungry. She didn't look away. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step closer, invading his personal space completely. The air between them crackled with an electric, dangerous energy. She asked him, her voice a sultry, challenging purr, if he was going to just stand there glaring at her all night, or if he was going to help her rip up his priceless floorboards to find the manual override cables. Julian didn't move a muscle. He stared at the lush, perfect curve of her lips, then slowly let his gaze travel up to meet her eyes. He told her, his voice rough and deep, that he wasn't lifting a single finger until she told him her real name. The tension in the sweltering red-lit room was so thick it felt like it was choking them. Clara held his intense gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of their suddenly elevated breathing and the distant, dying hum of the severed electronics. Finally, a slow, dangerously beautiful smirk spread across her face. She told him her name was Clara. And she told him, her eyes dropping briefly to the knot of his silk robe, that he was going to need to take that off if he didn't want to pass out from heat stroke in the next 20 minutes. Julian stared at her. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the suffocatingly hot penthouse was the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat. He was a man who dictated the terms of every interaction, a man who moved markets with a single phone call, and yet, standing in the pulsing red glow of the emergency lights, he found himself completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of this woman. Clara didn't break eye contact. She stood there, her lush, hourglass figure wrapped in that sleek tactical suit, radiating a quiet, dangerous confidence that was utterly intoxicating. Slowly, deliberately, Julian reached up and grasped the lapels of his bespoke silk robe. He didn't break her gaze as he slid the heavy fabric off his broad shoulders, letting it drop to the floor beside her discarded maid's uniform. Underneath, he wore only a pair of dark, tailored lounge pants. The red emergency lights cast harsh, dramatic shadows across his pale, sharply angled chest and the defined muscles of his stomach. He wasn't just a billionaire who sat behind a desk. He possessed the lean, coiled physique of a man who spent his minimal free time aggressively sparring in private gyms. Clara's eyes flickered downward for a fraction of a second, tracing the sharp lines of his torso, before snapping back up to his face. She didn't say a word, but the slight, almost imperceptible parting of her full lips told Julian everything he needed to know. The magnetic pull was completely mutual. Julian stepped past her, the heat of his bare arm briefly grazing the soft fabric of her suit. He walked toward the center of the expansive living room, the temperature already climbing toward an unbearable degree. He knelt on the priceless imported oak flooring, running his hands over the barely visible seams. He told her, his voice rough and tight, that the manual override junction for the blast shields was beneath the floorboards, but the electromagnetic lock was fried. They were going to have to pry it open by brute force. Clara followed him, dropping to her knees on the opposite side of the seam. The tactical suit stretched tightly across the exaggerated, feminine curve of her hips and thighs as she moved. She reached into the silver pouch strapped to her thigh, pulling out a heavy, incredibly sleek titanium pry bar. She slid it across the floor to him. She told him to use his leverage, adding with a sly, breathless smirk that he looked like he could handle the heavy lifting. Julian grabbed the cold metal, his jaw clenching. He wedged the titanium bar into the microscopic gap in the oak. As he strained, the muscles in his arms and back flexing under the immense pressure, he looked up at her through the crimson shadows. He asked her how she got past the biometric scanners in the elevator. He wanted to know how she managed to ghost her way into the most secure building in the hemisphere without tripping a single alarm. Clara leaned forward, pressing her hands flat against the wood to stabilize the floorboard. The movement deepened the plunge of her unzipped collar, exposing the beautiful, rich glow of her skin, slick with a fine sheen of sweat. She told him that his security was flawless against machines, but incredibly arrogant against human nature. She explained that he relied so heavily on artificial intelligence to protect his empire that he completely ignored the invisible people who maintained it. The maids, the caterers, the delivery drivers. She had simply cloned the master biometric data off his head of security during a crowded coffee run 3 months ago. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the room as the oak floorboard finally snapped upward, revealing a chaotic tangle of thick black cabling underneath. Julian tossed the pry bar aside, his chest heaving as he gasped for the thinning air. The penthouse was a literal oven now. The heavy blast shields were trapping the heat from the massive, dying server farm in the next room, turning the air thick and utterly unbreathable. If the tension between Clara and Julian is making your heart race right now, you need to hit that subscribe button immediately. We are just getting to the good part, and you don't want to miss a single second of this absolute masterclass in enemies to lovers tension. Give the video a like, and tell me in the comments, do you think Julian is more furious about the hack or more obsessed with the hacker? Let's find out. Clara reached down into the dark cavity beneath the floor, her fingers tracing the thick, insulated wires. She was breathing heavily, the stifling heat visibly taking its toll. She pulled the zipper of her tactical suit down another 2 inches, seeking any kind of relief. Julian watched the movement, his eyes tracking the delicate slide of the zipper, completely mesmerized. He forced himself to look away, reaching down into the floorboard to help her. His large, pale hand accidentally brushed against her knuckles in the dark. The extreme visual contrast of his sharp, angular fingers against the soft, deeply melanated warmth of her hand was striking. The physical contact, however brief, sent a visible shockwave through both of them. Clara snatched her hand back, her breath catching in her throat, while Julian froze, his dark eyes instantly locking onto hers. The hostility was rapidly melting, burning away in the oppressive heat of the room, leaving behind something incredibly raw and dangerous. Julian sat back on his heels, abandoning the wires for a moment. He looked at her, truly looked at her, stripping away the titles of billionaire and maid, CEO and hacker. He told her she was entirely too brilliant to be playing corporate mercenary. He told her that women with her level of intellect didn't risk their lives doing the dirty work for cowards who hide behind computer screens, unless they were running from something. Clara let out a harsh, cynical laugh, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She leaned back, supporting her weight on her hands, the posture throwing the magnificent curves of her body into sharp relief against the red emergency lights. She told him he was projecting. She said he looked at her and saw a puzzle to solve because he spent his entire life building a glass cage in the sky just to avoid dealing with real people. She called him out. She told him he was the loneliest man she had ever observed. The accuracy of her words felt like a knife slipping cleanly between his ribs. Julian didn't flinch, but his eyes darkened. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until he could feel the radiating heat of her body. He told her that he built his cage to keep the parasites out. And then, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register, he noted that she was the only one who ever managed to pick the lock. The air was so heavy it was difficult to draw breath. Clara stared at his lips, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The adrenaline of the hack, the terror of the lockdown, and the overwhelming, suffocating heat were acting as a massive, undeniable aphrodisiac. She tried to think of a sharp comeback, a witty remark to put the arrogant billionaire back in his place, but her mind was completely blank. All she could focus on was the intense, predatory hunger radiating from his dark eyes and the way the sweat glistened on his collarbones. Julian abruptly stood up, breaking the magnetic spell before it completely consumed them. He told her to stay put. He walked over to the massive modern wet bar situated against the far wall of the living room. The ice maker had long since died, but he reached into a lower cabinet and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with a dark, amber liquid. It was an impossibly rare, 90-year-old Korean whiskey he reserved strictly for celebrating the destruction of his corporate rivals. Tonight, however, it served a different purpose. He poured 2 generous measures into heavy crystal tumblers and walked back to where Clara was still sitting on the floor. He handed her a glass. His large, pale fingers lingered against hers for a second longer than necessary as she took it. She looked down at the amber liquid, swirling it slowly. She asked him if he was trying to get her drunk so she would fix his blast shields for free. Julian sat down right beside her on the floor, abandoning any pretense of personal space. The side of his bare arm pressed firmly against the sleek fabric covering her shoulder. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of heat straight to his core. He took a slow sip of the burning whiskey, his eyes never leaving her beautiful face. He told her that the blast shields were a secondary concern. He told her that right now, the only thing he was trying to figure out was how long it would take for her to admit that she wanted him just as badly as he wanted her. Clara froze, the crystal tumbler halfway to her lips. The blunt, unapologetic honesty of his words hung in the sweltering, red-lit air. She turned her head slowly, looking him dead in the eyes. They were inches apart now. She could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath, mixed with the raw, masculine scent of his skin. The power dynamic in the room shifted, so violently it practically created a sonic boom. She wasn't an employee anymore. He wasn't a target. They were just a man and a woman, trapped in a cage, stripped of all their armor. Clara lowered the glass. A slow, deeply sensual smile spread across her face, lighting up her dark eyes with a dangerous fire. She leaned in, her full lips brushing dangerously close to the sharp angle of his jaw. She whispered into the heavy, quiet air, telling him that he was incredibly arrogant to assume she was the one who was going to break first. The heavy crystal tumbler hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing thud. Julian didn't just take the glass from Clara's hand. He snatched it, abandoning it in the dark without breaking his intense, predatory gaze. Her whispered challenge was the final spark needed to ignite the absolute powder keg of tension between them. The suffocating heat of the lockdown penthouse, the pulsing crimson glow of the emergency lights, and the adrenaline of the massive cyber breach all instantly condensed into a single, explosive point of gravity. He moved with a sudden, coiled speed that completely belied his composed billionaire persona. His large, pale hands shot forward, gripping her waist. He didn't pull her to him. He surged forward, trapping her lush, hyper-feminine body between his broad chest and the heavy leather of the sofa behind her. Clara gasped, a sharp intake of the sweltering air, but she didn't shrink away. Her hands immediately flew up, coming to rest flat against his bare, desperately warm chest. She could feel the furious, hammering rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. It was wild, erratic, completely out of his famous, ironclad control. He leaned down, his face hovering mere millimeters from hers. The scent of him, rich Korean whiskey, the sharp tang of sweat and raw, unrestrained masculinity was completely intoxicating. His voice was a guttural, breathless rasp that sent a violent shiver straight down her spine. He told her that he had spent his entire life building impenetrable systems, predicting every variable and eliminating every single threat. He told her she was the absolute most dangerous thing he had ever let through his doors. Clara tilted her chin up, refusing to yield an inch of her power, even as her body betrayed her with a trembling wave of pure desire. Her dark, expressive eyes locked onto his. She whispered back, her voice thick and heavy in the stifling air. She told him that a system is only as strong as its creator, and right now, his system was completely falling apart. Julian's control finally, spectacularly shattered. He didn't just kiss her. He conquered her mouth. It was a fiercely aggressive, hungry collision of two alpha personalities who had spent the last 2 hours completely tearing each other apart. Clara let out a soft, desperate sound, her hands sliding up his chest to wrap fiercely around his neck. She pulled him closer, matching his desperate energy completely. The kiss tasted like expensive whiskey and absolute surrender. All the corporate posturing, all the lies, all the tactical armor they wore to protect themselves from the world completely melted away in the searing heat of the penthouse. He pushed her back, his hands tracing the dramatic, unapologetic curves of her waist and hips through the sleek fabric of her tactical suit. The extreme visual contrast between them was breathtaking in the dim, red light. His pale, sharp, aristocratic hands gripping her soft, deeply melanated skin. The harsh, angular lines of his body pressing perfectly against the lush, breathtaking softness of hers. Julian broke the kiss just long enough for them to drag in a ragged breath of the thin air. He gripped the edge of her unzipped collar. His eyes, completely black with desire, asked a silent, burning question. Clara didn't hesitate. She looked him dead in the eyes and told him to take it off. The heavy metallic sound of the zipper tearing downward echoed through the massive, empty room. If this explosive collision has you holding your breath, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Give this video a like and drop a comment below. Did you expect Julian to break his billionaire control, or did Clara completely orchestrate this surrender? Let me know, and let's get right back into the heat. The sleek, dark fabric of her suit fell away, revealing the magnificent, breathtaking reality of her figure. Julian let out a shaky, reverent exhale. He had been surrounded by beautiful, flawless people his entire life, people manufactured by wealth and plastic, but looking at Clara in the pulsing crimson shadows, he realized he had never actually seen true, radiant beauty before. Her deep, flawless skin seemed to absorb and reflect the warm, amber glow of the room. She was entirely gorgeous, powerfully feminine, and entirely his. He swept her off her feet with effortless strength. Clara wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms locking around his neck as he carried her away from the floorboards and toward the massive, plush rug stationed in the center of the living room. The world outside the heavy steel blast shields completely ceased to exist. There were no rival corporations, no stolen codes, no billions of dollars hanging in the balance. There was only the unbearable heat of the room and the desperate electric friction of their bodies. He laid her down on the soft expanse of the rug, following her down instantly. The sheer weight of him, the hard, coiled muscle of his torso pressing against her soft curves, drew a sharp, beautiful cry from her lips. The silence of the lockdown penthouse was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy sounds of their breathing and the soft, urgent whispers exchanged in the dark. Julian's hands were everywhere, tracing the dip of her waist, the swell of her hips, mapping the territory of the enemy he had just completely surrendered to. His touch wasn't just lustful, it was profoundly worshipful. Every press of his lips against her jaw, her neck, her collarbones, felt like a confession. He was a man who had isolated himself on a throne of glass, completely untouched by the world, and Clara was pulling him violently back down to earth. For Clara, the emotional impact was just as staggering. She was a woman who made a living being invisible, slipping in and out of lives without leaving a trace, never allowing anyone to truly see her. But as Julian looked down at her, his dark eyes wide and completely unguarded. She felt entirely seen. He wasn't looking at a maid, and he wasn't looking at a master hacker. He was looking at her. Just Clara. The physical union was slow, agonizingly deep, and painfully beautiful. When they finally became one, a sharp, collective gasp echoed through the stifling room. Julian buried his face in the crook of her neck, his sharp jaw pressing against her pulse point. He held himself completely still for a long, vibrating moment, simply absorbing the profound, shocking intimacy of the connection. Clara's hands smoothed down his broad, sweating back, pulling him deeper, anchoring him to her. They moved together in a heavy, mesmerizing rhythm. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic energy of their earlier argument. It was a deliberate, passionate conversation spoken entirely without words. The contrast of their bodies moving together in the crimson shadows was a masterpiece of tension and release. His pale skin slick with sweat, her rich, dark skin glowing like embers in the firelight. Every shift, every desperate sigh, stripped away another layer of their lonely, isolated lives. Julian whispered her name over and over, like it was a prayer he had just learned. He told her she was destroying him. He told her he never wanted her to stop. Clara pulled his face down to hers, silencing his confessions with another deep, bruising kiss. She pushed her hips up to meet his every movement, completely matching his intense, dominating energy with her own fierce power. She wasn't yielding to the billionaire. She was claiming him right back. The climax hit them like a physical shockwave. Julian's entire body went rigid, a deep, guttural groan tearing from his throat as he finally let go of every single ounce of his legendary control. He collapsed against her, his chest heaving, his heart hammering wildly against her own. Clara held him tightly, her fingers tangled in his dark, damp hair, her eyes fluttering shut as the intense, euphoric wave of release washed completely over her. For a long, indeterminate amount of time, neither of them moved. The penthouse was deathly quiet again, the only sound the slow, gradual deceleration of their intertwined breathing. The oppressive heat of the room no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a warm, heavy blanket isolating them from the rest of the universe. Julian slowly shifted his weight, rolling onto his side but pulling Clara flush against his chest. He wrapped his arm tightly around her lush waist, burying his face in her gorgeous, natural curls. He didn't want to let her go. For the first time in over a decade, the restless, calculating machine in his mind was completely quiet. He felt grounded. He felt safe. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his chest. She listened to the steady, comforting thud of his heart. A deep, unexpected ache bloomed in her chest. This was a massive mistake. She was an extractor. She had a job to do. She had a rival syndicate waiting for her to fail, and she had just slept with the target she was hired to completely ruin. She opened her eyes, staring at the heavy steel blast shields completely blocking out the city lights. The pulsing red emergency lights cast long, dramatic shadows across the room. She knew that as soon as the sun rose and the secondary grid naturally rebooted, those shields were going to retract. The cold, sterile reality of the penthouse was going to flood back in. Julian Kwon was going to put his bespoke suit back on, and he was going to remember exactly who he was, and exactly what she was. Julian's breathing deepened, his body going completely slack as exhaustion finally overtook him. The adrenaline crash was massive. He had surrendered everything to her, including his consciousness. He trusted her. Clara waited 10 full minutes, ensuring he was entirely under. Then, moving with the slow, agonizing precision of a ghost, she gently untangled herself from his embrace. The sudden loss of his body heat made her shiver despite the sweltering temperature of the room. She sat up, picking up her discarded tactical suit from the floor. She looked down at Julian's sleeping face. In the red light, with his sharp features softened by sleep, he looked incredibly young. He looked peaceful. She felt a dangerous, terrifying sting of tears prick the back of her eyes. She fiercely blinked them away. She couldn't afford emotions. Emotions got extractors killed. She zipped up her suit, stepping away from the plush rug. She didn't head for the exit. Instead, she walked silently back toward the private server room. The blue glow of the mainframe had completely died, but her silver decryption drive, still plugged into the master console, pulsed with a faint, steady green light. It was time to finish the job. But as she placed her hands over the holographic keyboard, she made a decision that was going to completely change the trajectory of both of their lives. She wasn't going to steal his code for her employers. She was going to do something much, much worse. Clara stood in the suffocating, sweltering darkness of the private server room. Her hands hovered over the glass surface of the master console. The silver decryption drive was fully integrated. The progress bar on the massive curved screen hit 100%. The unbreakable code, the absolute crown jewel of Julian Kwon's tech empire, the algorithm that her shadow employers were willing to kill for, was completely unlocked and ready to be transferred. All she had to do was hit the execute key. With one tap of her finger, billions of dollars in intellectual property would instantly shift across the globe to a rival syndicate. Her job would be done. Her massive payout would be secured. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She looked back over her shoulder, peering through the heavy glass doors toward the dark living room. Through the pulsing red emergency lights, she could just barely make out the silhouette of the ruthless, supposedly untouchable billionaire. He was sleeping peacefully on the floor, his broad, pale shoulders rising and falling in a steady, trusting rhythm. He had completely let his guard down. He had looked at her, truly looked at her, with such raw, unguarded reverence. Clara knew how her employers operated. If she sent this code to the syndicate, they wouldn't just ruin him financially. They would completely dismantle his life, frame him for the breach, and ensure he never worked in the industry again. But if she simply walked away empty-handed, leaving the code intact, her employers would know she flipped. They would hunt her down to the ends of the earth. There was only one play left on the massive, complicated board. A chaotic, entirely scorched earth move. Clara's fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh light of the monitors. She bypassed the external transfer protocols completely. Instead, she opened the core directory and initiated a deep-root, unrecoverable system purge. A military-grade data wipe. She was going to burn it all down. Every line of code, every complex algorithm, every single backup server physically located in the Penthouse vault. She was destroying his life's work, so that absolutely no one else could ever use it against him. It was a massive, multi-billion-dollar act of sabotage, driven entirely by a sudden, fierce need to protect him. The screen flashed a violent yellow, demanding a final confirmation. Clara didn't hesitate. She hit enter. A low, mechanical whine built up inside the server racks as the hard drives began systematically wiping themselves into absolute oblivion. Clara pulled her silver decryption drive from the port and slipped it back into her tactical pouch. She walked silently out of the server room, her boots making no sound against the floorboards. She stopped beside Julian one last time. The extreme visual contrast of his sharp, aristocratic features against the dark, heavy rug made her heart physically ache. She reached into her pouch and pulled out her sleek, black encrypted burner phone. She typed a single brief message on the screen, leaving the display glowing brightly in the dim room. She knelt down, the lush curves of her tactical suit pulling tight, and placed the phone gently on the floor, right next to his resting hand. She leaned in, her lips lightly brushing against the soft hair at his temple. She whispered a quiet, barely audible goodbye into the stifling heat of the room. Then she stood up, walked to the manual override panel they had exposed earlier, and bypassed the fried electromagnetic lock. The countdown to the system reboot began. Clara slipped out the heavy front doors, dissolving into the shadows of the building, just as the penthouse clock struck 6 in the morning. If you are screaming at your screen right now because of that massive twist, make sure you hit that subscribe button immediately. Drop a comment below and tell me, did Clara make the right choice by destroying his empire to save his life? Give this video a like to help us out, and let's see how the billionaire wakes up. 5 minutes later, the automated backup generators finally kicked in. A sharp, electronic beep echoed through the penthouse. The heavy, pulsing red emergency lights abruptly died. In their place, the harsh, bright, clinical white LED lights of the ceiling snapped on, instantly flooding the room in blinding, sterile clarity. The massive steel blast shields covering the floor-to-ceiling windows shuddered violently, then began to retract upward with a loud, grinding mechanical hum. As the steel lifted, brilliant golden morning sunlight poured into the expansive living room. The steady, familiar rush of the central air conditioning roared back to life, rapidly cooling the suffocating heat of the room. The magical, insulated, intensely intimate world they had created in the dark was instantly, violently shattered. Reality had returned. Julian groaned, his sharp brow furrowing at the sudden invasion of harsh sunlight. He blindly reached out across the plush rug, his large hand sweeping over the fabric, searching for the warm, incredibly soft curves of the woman who had completely consumed his mind just hours ago. His hand found nothing but cold, empty space. Julian's eyes snapped open. He sat up, the cold air conditioning hitting his bare chest. He looked around the massive, pristine living room. The discarded maid's uniform was still on the floor. His silk robe lay where he had dropped it. But the tactical, brilliant, breathtakingly beautiful woman was completely gone. The cold, familiar armor of the ruthless instantly snapped back into place. His jaw clenched tight. He pushed himself off the floor, grabbing his discarded robe and shrugging it over his broad shoulders. He tied the belt with vicious, sharp movements. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He moved with cold, calculated precision straight toward the private server room. He stepped through the glass doors, expecting to find his systems hijacked and his data siphoned off to a rival network. He expected to see the transfer logs showing millions of files being stolen. Instead, he found absolutely nothing. The massive, curved monitors were completely black, save for a single blinking cursor in the top left corner. The server racks, usually humming with intense processing power, were deathly quiet. Julian stepped up to the master console and typed in his administrative override. The screen flashed a simple, brutal text prompt. System directory empty. 0 bytes found. Julian stared at the screen, his brilliant, analytical mind racing to process the impossible information. She didn't steal it. If she had transferred the data, there would be a ghost trail. There would be packet remnants. But this was a complete, deliberate incineration. She hadn't sold him out to his rivals. She had completely neutralized the board so that no one could win. A strange, unfamiliar sound broke the silence of the server room. It was a low, dark chuckle. Julian ran a hand through his messy, dark hair, leaning heavily against the console. He was utterly ruined. His life's work was gone. And yet, he didn't feel angry. He felt an intense, overwhelming rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She had outplayed everyone, including him. He walked slowly back into the bright, sunlit living room. That was when a faint, white glow caught his eye. Resting on the dark rug, exactly where her head had been, was a sleek black phone. Julian walked over and picked it up. The device was unlocked. There was only one application open on the screen, a secure, encrypted messaging channel. And there was only one message, sent just minutes before the blast shields raised. He read the words on the screen, his dark eyes tracing the bright letters. The text read, "Your code is gone. Your rivals have nothing. Consider your security system successfully tested. Catch me if you can." Julian stood in the center of his massive, empty penthouse, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, glittering city far below. The cold, lonely billionaire who had started the night was completely dead and gone. The man standing in the sunlight was entirely different. He was a man with a limitless bank account, a genius intellect, and a brand new, absolute obsession. He looked back down at the glowing screen of the burner phone. A slow, incredibly dangerous smirk spread across his sharp, handsome face. He gripped the phone tightly in his pale hand. He whispered to the empty room, his voice a low, lethal promise. He told her she better run fast, because he was coming for her. And that is where we are going to leave this incredible, high-tension chapter. If you want to see Julian use his billions to hunt down the gorgeous, brilliant extractor who stole his heart and destroyed his servers, you need to let me know in the comments right now. Type part 2 if you want the chase to begin. Before you click away, I want to give a massive, heartfelt thank you to everyone utilizing the super thanks feature on the channel. Creating these immersive, Cinematic Audio Stories takes extensive work behind the scenes. Your super thanks contributions are strictly used to directly upgrade the AI visual generators, the premium voice cloning software, and the cinematic soundscapes that make these characters feel so incredibly real. You are literally the producers of this channel, and I cannot thank you enough for fueling the next story. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single upload. You could also support the channel by buying super thanks. Until next time, stay safe and keep listening.